The year was 1944. Europe was burning, and the fate of nations was being written not only on the battlefield, but also in the quiet corners of prisoner-of-war camps scattered across America. Here, behind tall fences and under the watchful eyes of armed guards, thousands of captured German soldiers were forced into a world unlike anything they had known before. For these men, the war had been about discipline, steel, and pride. They had marched through the ruins of Europe in heavy boots built for endurance and conquest, boots that carried the dust of villages and the mud of battlefields. To them, footwear was not a matter of comfort. It was a matter of survival. Their stiff leather boots, worn down by endless marches, symbolized strength. And when they caught sight of the Americans' shoes, they couldn't help but laugh. Soft soles, lightweight canvas. To the German mind, these strange shoes looked like toys, fragile and serious, incapable of withstanding the brutal trials of war. The laughter echoed in the camps, a mix of mockery and disbelief. What kind of soldiers, they thought, would go to war in such footwear? But laughter has a way of hiding ignorance. And soon, these men would discover that what they dismissed as weakness was, in truth, something far more enduring. For when they finally slipped those American shoes onto their feet, they felt something they had not known in years. Relief, comfort, a small but undeniable taste of freedom. And in that quiet, almost invisible moment, pride began to soften. The shoes they had mocked became the shoes they secretly wished to keep. The camp was alive with a strange mixture of tension and monotony. Days bled into nights, nights into days, and for the German prisoners, time itself seemed suspended between humiliation and survival. They were far from the front lines, far from the Reich, far from the thunder of artillery and the shriek of Stukas diving across the skies. Here in the heart of America, the war still clung to them like an invisible chain, but it was different, softer, stranger, almost disorienting. They were not starving, they were not beaten, they were not tortured. Instead, they were clothed, fed, and kept under guard in neat rows of barracks. Yet even in relative comfort, pride remained their shield. And pride is a difficult thing to surrender. One of the most common sights to draw their attention and their derision were the American guards themselves. Tall, broad-shouldered men moving casually through the camp, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders, their boots nowhere to be seen. Instead of the hard leather footwear the Germans had worn across Poland, France, and Russia, the Americans walked in what looked like shoes made for the leisure of civilians. Canvas, soft, almost flimsy at first glance. To a German eye trained in years of military tradition, these were laughable. A soldier, they believed, was defined not only by the uniform on his back, but by the boots on his feet. Those boots were a symbol of endurance, of conquest, of authority. Without them, you were not a soldier, you were a worker, a peasant, or worse, a civilian pretending to play at war. So when shipments of supplies came in, the laughter began. It was not shy laughter, not muffled whispers, but loud, mocking roars that rolled through the camp yard like echoes of victory parades gone by. They pointed, gestured, and spoke in their rough dialects about how ridiculous the Americans looked. Some of the younger POWs mimicked their guards, prancing around in exaggerated steps, raising jeers from the others. The older ones smirked quietly, certain that this small example proved the weakness of their captors. How could these men, wearing shoes that seemed more suited to a schoolyard than a battlefield, possibly represent the might of a nation? But beneath the laughter, something else lingered. It was a truth the Germans themselves refused to admit, even to one another. Their boots, symbols of strength and conquest, were not what they had once been. The leather was cracked, hardened by mud and soaked with years of sweat and rain. The soles, hammered with nails, were worn thin, some splitting at the edges. For years, they had carried their owners across countless marches. In Poland, where the earth turned black with smoke. In France, where cobbled streets rang under their heels. And in Russia, where the frozen ground itself seemed determined to break them. Those boots had been companions in conquest, yes, but they had also been instruments of suffering. Every man carried scars on his feet, blisters, hardened calluses, nails pressed cruelly against skin. The laughter at American shoes, then, was also a kind of defense. To admit the possibility of comfort, of ease, of a different kind of strength, would be to admit that everything they had endured, the endless marches, the grinding weight of leather and iron, might have been unnecessary suffering. So they laughed louder, they mocked harder, and in their voices was a hint of desperation. The Americans themselves paid little mind to this. Their guards did not need to prove themselves through boots. They had already proven themselves on the battlefield, in skies darkened by bombers, in seas churned by steel. They walked with a confidence the Germans could not quite name, a confidence that did not need the weight of tradition to carry it. The POWs noticed, even if they did not say it aloud, that the guards seemed to move with more freedom. Their steps were lighter, their pace more natural. While German boots struck the ground with stiff rhythm, the Americans glided across it as though the earth was not an enemy, but a companion. Still, pride is a stubborn companion. In their barracks at night, the prisoners whispered and chuckled about the ridiculousness of it all. They will never march 500 kilometers in those things, one would say. They would freeze in Russia before the first step, another would add. The laughter became a ritual, a shield against the reality that they were no longer in control of their world. It was easier to laugh at shoes than to acknowledge defeat, but curiosity is a trait that no soldier, no man, can fully suppress. Even as they mocked, even as they jeered, many found their eyes drawn to the strange footwear of their captors. They noticed how the guards did not limp at the end of long shifts. They noticed how the Americans rarely complained of sore feet, even after standing guard for hours under the hot sun. And they noticed, too, how the shoes seemed to survive even after weeks of use. What they had dismissed as fragile toys were not falling apart, not tearing, not giving way under the weight of duty. The laughter, though still loud, began to thin around the edges. It was no longer the laughter of certainty, but the laughter of men, trying to convince themselves that what they saw was not real. The day would come when mockery would give way to silence, when the first German prisoner would dare to slip his foot inside a pair of American shoes and discover what his pride had tried to shield him from. But in those early days, before that quiet moment of revelation, the camp was filled with the sound of laughter, a brittle sound, sharp and hollow, echoing against the fences and the guard towers. It was the laughter of men clinging to the memory of what they once believed unshakable, that their boots, their traditions, their symbols of strength, were superior to anything the enemy could create, and yet, deep down, many of them already knew that laughter was not enough to drown out the truth. The day the first German prisoner slipped his foot into an American shoe, the camp seemed to hold its breath. The mocking laughter that had echoed for weeks was suddenly replaced by silence. No one expected what followed, not even the prisoner himself. He had done it half in jest, half in defiance, perhaps hoping to spark yet another round of laughter from his comrades. But instead, when he lowered his foot into that unfamiliar shape, when the sole cushioned his step and the canvas flexed with the natural rhythm of his movement, something inside him stopped. He did not laugh. He did not speak. He simply stood there, blinking as though the world had shifted slightly beneath him. To the other prisoners, the moment was unsettling. They had expected him to prance about like a fool, to exaggerate his movements, to make a clown of himself for their amusement. But his face betrayed no humor. Instead, it carried something far more dangerous, the flicker of recognition. He looked down at his feet, as though they were no longer his own, as though the simple act of walking had transformed into something entirely unfamiliar. For years, the Germans had lived in boots that were stiff, unforgiving, symbols of iron will. Those boots carried with them the weight of an empire, the memory of marches across continents, and the pain of endless blisters. They were more prison than protection, and yet the men had convinced themselves they were strength itself. To step into something soft, something flexible, something that seemed to honor comfort as much as endurance, was to step into another world. One by one, the others followed. Some did it quietly, slipping the shoes on when the guards were not watching. Others did it openly, daring to defy their own pride. At first, they moved cautiously, afraid the soles might tear, afraid the stitching might give way. But the shoes held. They bent when they walked, flexed when they ran small circles in the camp yard, absorbed the shock of their steps in a way no German boot ever had. And as they moved, their faces began to change. The smirks melted away, replaced by surprise, then disbelief, and finally something none of them wanted to admit aloud: envy. The sensation was more than physical. It was psychological, almost spiritual. For years, the German soldier had been taught that suffering was noble, that pain was proof of endurance, that hardship forged strength. Every blister was a badge, every ache a lesson, every cracked boot a reminder of sacrifice for the fatherland. Yet here was a simple shoe, designed by a nation that seemed to value not suffering, but ease, not hardship, but innovation. The Americans had built a tool not for punishment, but for preservation. A shoe that allowed a man to work, march, or fight without crippling him. The prisoners felt betrayed by their own traditions, as though their leaders had forced them into needless agony, while their enemies quietly built a better way. The irony was not lost on them. They had once mocked these shoes as symbols of weakness, yet now they realized they were emblems of strength of a different kind. A strength that flowed not from domination but from practicality. It was not the kind of strength that ground men down into dust. It was the kind of strength that allowed men to stand longer, walk farther, fight fresher. For the first time, the Germans began to wonder if perhaps they had misunderstood their captors, not just their footwear, but their philosophy of war itself. The guards, for their part, rarely acknowledged this silent shift. They simply wore their shoes and carried on with their duties, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place in the minds of the men behind the wire. But the POWs could not unsee what they had felt. They could not forget the lightness in their steps, the relief from years of pressure, the sudden freedom of moving without pain. Some confessed quietly to each other in hushed tones, late at night in the barracks, that the Americans had gotten it right. Others still tried to hold on to their pride, insisting that boots were the mark of true soldiers. Yet even they could not deny the look on their comrades' faces when they walked across the camp yard in those shoes, shoulders straighter, strides easier, as if chains had fallen from their ankles. It was a strange and humbling thing to realize that power did not always roar in the form of iron and leather. Sometimes it whispered through softness, through innovation, through a simple piece of canvas and rubber. For men who had marched across Europe, who had believed themselves to be the very edge of human strength and discipline, the discovery was devastating. And yet it was also liberating. To feel relief where there had only been pain. To feel freedom where there had only been burden. These were emotions that no amount of pride could suppress. In that moment, they learned something that few admitted aloud. That a nation which cared for the comfort of its soldiers, that spared them unnecessary suffering, might possess a deeper kind of strength than one that demanded suffering as proof of loyalty. It was a lesson carried not in speeches or battles, but in every cushioned step across the dusty ground of the camp. The lesson that strength could be human, and that war, in its darkest form, could still leave room for innovation that honored life rather than crushed it. The camp was changing. It was subtle at first, almost invisible, the kind of change that crept in quietly, like a whisper moving through the barracks at night. The sound of laughter, the cruel mocking kind that once filled the air whenever American shoes appeared, had faded. In its place was something far quieter, something unspoken: envy. What had once been a joke had transformed into a desire that no one could easily admit, yet everyone could feel. The German prisoners, proud men of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, men who once marched in step across conquered capitals, now found themselves looking down at their own boots with resentment. The leather that had once symbolized strength now seemed like shackles. The nails hammered into the soles, dug into their feet like punishment. And whenever their eyes fell upon the Americans moving easily in their lightweight footwear, they felt the sting of longing. It began with small trades. A prisoner offering to sweep the yard or scrub pans for the kitchen detail, all for the chance to borrow a pair of American shoes for an hour. Others volunteered for camp labor, knowing they might be rewarded with hand-me-downs or discarded pairs. Even the simplest glimpse of comfort was enough. When one man returned from work wearing those shoes, his comrades stared, not with ridicule but with hunger. They watched him move differently, with a stride that seemed less burdened, his posture a little straighter, his steps no longer pounding against the ground but gliding across it. He did not boast about the shoes. He didn't need to. His silent movement said everything. Pride made the prisoners keep their desires hidden, but the truth spread quickly, and soon enough trades became more frequent. A cigarette ration, a small carving made from scrap wood, an extra slice of bread, all were offered up for the chance to wear the shoes of the enemy. In those quiet exchanges, a strange respect began to grow. Respect not only for the shoes themselves, but for the nation that had made them. The Germans realized that the Americans fought not by breaking their men down, but by preserving them. This was more than footwear. It was philosophy stitched into fabric and soul, a belief that endurance did not have to be born from suffering, but could instead come from strength, protected, comfort valued, humanity preserved. At night, the barracks were filled with whispers. Men spoke in hushed voices about what they had felt, the relief of walking without blisters, the freedom of toes not crushed by leather, the lightness of steps unchained from steel. Some admitted openly that they would never again see boots in the same way. Others still resisted, their pride clinging desperately to the idea that German craftsmanship, tradition, and discipline were superior. Yet even those men could not hide the evidence written across their bodies. They rubbed sore feet raw from their boots, while their comrades in American shoes rested comfortably. The divide was clear, and slowly resistance crumbled. The transformation was not just physical but psychological. It was a small, almost invisible revolution in thought. These prisoners, once filled with certainty of their own superiority, began to question. If the Americans had built shoes that spared their men suffering, what else had they built differently? If they valued the comfort of a soldier, perhaps they valued the individual in other ways as well. And if they had thought so carefully about something as small as footwear, what did that say about their larger vision of war, of society, of the future? The Germans, who had once looked down on their captors, now found themselves glancing upward with reluctant admiration. Every step in those shoes became a lesson. Every moment spent walking in comfort revealed what years of propaganda had hidden from them, that strength could take many forms, and that true endurance was not measured by how much pain one could bear, but by how wisely one could avoid it. They began to see their own suffering differently, to question whether the endless marches across Europe, the blisters endured in silence, the pride bound up in leather and iron had truly been necessary, or whether it had been a burden placed upon them by leaders who valued symbols over humanity. In the stillness of camp evenings, when the sun dipped behind the fences and shadows stretched across the earth, some prisoners would remove their boots and hold them in their hands, staring down at them as though seeing them for the first time. The cracks in the leather, the nails jutting through the soles, the stiffness that had once felt like armor now looked like a relic of a harsher, crueler vision of war. Nearby, another prisoner would walk slowly in American shoes, his steps quiet, soft, and strangely free. No one laughed anymore. Instead, there was silence, a silence heavy with realization. The envy of those shoes was more than envy of comfort. It was envy of what they represented, a different way of thinking, a different way of fighting, a different way of living. It was envy of a philosophy that dared to say a soldier was worth more than the pain he could endure, that comfort was not weakness, and that innovation could serve humanity even in the midst of destruction. By then, the lesson was unavoidable. The prisoners had discovered that what they once mocked as fragile had become the very thing they desired most. And in that discovery lay a quiet respect, a recognition that strength did not always march in heavy boots. Sometimes it walked softly, carried by shoes they once ridiculed but now longed to call their own. By the time the war's end drew near, the laughter that had once filled the prisoner of war camps was nothing but a memory. It seemed almost impossible to the German prisoners that they had ever mocked the Americans for their shoes. What had once been the subject of ridicule had become a quiet revelation, and in that revelation lay the seed of change. The boots that had marched them across Europe, boots that had stomped through the mud of Poland and the snow of Russia, now sat heavy and lifeless beside their bunks. Many of the men no longer looked at them with pride, but with weariness, as if the boots themselves carried the weight of everything they had lost. In contrast, the American shoes, light, soft, and simple, had taken on a meaning far larger than their size. They were no longer just footwear. They were symbols of something the Germans could not ignore: practicality, humanity, and a kind of strength they had never understood before. The memory of the first laugh now embarrassed them. At night, when the camp grew quiet, some men admitted to one another how foolish they had been. They recalled the sneers, the mocking voices, the certainty with which they had dismissed those shoes as toys unfit for soldiers. And yet, when they slipped their feet into them, they had discovered a truth that shattered their arrogance. They had discovered that real strength did not always march with iron soles or leather polished to a shine. Sometimes strength whispered. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of comfort that allowed a man to stand longer, to work harder, to endure with dignity. That whisper had spoken to them more deeply than any speech, more powerfully than any threat. It was a lesson they carried with them in silence. As the days passed, the lesson grew heavier. The war outside the fences raged on, but inside, the prisoners walked in shoes that reminded them daily of what they had once dismissed. Each step was an echo of realization. Each stride carried the weight of irony. They had fought for an empire that glorified pain, that demanded loyalty through suffering, that dressed its soldiers in boots designed as much for appearance as for endurance. But now, here they were, defeated and captured, walking in the shoes of their enemies, and realizing that their enemies had built something more enduring than conquest. It was a strange and humbling truth, one that gnawed at their pride, and yet brought an unexpected kind of relief. For many, those shoes became the most humanizing symbol of captivity. Behind the barbed wire, far from the Reich, far from propaganda and speeches, they found themselves rethinking what they had believed. The Americans had not only provided them food and shelter, they had given them a glimpse of a different philosophy, one where the soldier's well-being mattered, where innovation served the man rather than demanded sacrifice from him. A shoe might seem like a small thing, but to men who had marched until their feet bled, until their bodies collapsed, until their will was crushed beneath the weight of leather and iron, it was everything. It was proof that another way of living, another way of fighting, another way of being was possible. By the end of their captivity, the German POWs no longer mocked. They no longer sneered at the sight of American shoes. Instead, they walked quietly, some even reverently, as though each step carried a memory of revelation, and many would carry that memory home when the war was over. For years afterward, men who had once laughed would remember the feel of those soles beneath their feet, the strange lightness, the unexpected comfort. They would remember how something so small had shifted their understanding of strength. It was not the tanks, nor the planes, nor the rifles that had shaken their pride most deeply. It was the shoes. The shoes became a metaphor for the world they would enter after the war. A world that would no longer be built on iron discipline and endless suffering, but one that could embrace innovation, comfort, and practicality. Many of these men would return to a shattered Germany, a land reduced to ruins, and yet somewhere deep inside, they carried the memory of what they had learned behind American fences. They carried the lesson that strength did not always need to roar. Sometimes it could speak in quiet dignity, in small mercies, in the relief of walking without pain. As the camp fences stood tall against the setting sun, the men walked their yards one final time, some in boots that felt like relics of a defeated past, others in shoes that spoke of a different future. They looked down at their feet, some with shame, some with reflection, and some with a faint, reluctant respect. It was a simple thing, but it was unforgettable. In the end, the shoes they had once ridiculed became the shoes they wished to keep, not because of fashion, not because of pride, but because of the lesson they carried. A lesson that strength, real strength, is not found in unnecessary suffering. It is found in the wisdom to preserve, in the humanity to care, and in the quiet dignity of walking without pain.